Hi, today we're going to talk about the flow of nutrients through our ecosystem and through our biosphere and what actions humans have taken to impact the flow and the distribution of nutrients in our ecosystem. So let's remind ourselves of how matter and energy flows through our different trophic levels here on Earth. So we receive energy from the sun. Energy is taken up by primary producers, so these are plants for the most part. There are also other organisms that can convert energy from the sun into matter, but mostly when we think about primary producers, we're thinking about vegetation, anything that's green and can photosynthesize. Primary consumers are the next step in the chain. They are consuming the primary producers, so anything that lives on plants, on vegetation, is going to be a primary consumer. Secondary consumers consume the primary consumers, and so forth. All matter, as it flows through these different trophic levels, once something passes away, it will be decayed, right? So microorganisms and other decomposers are going to decompose that matter and turn it back into detritus. And that's the flow of matter through our ecosystem. And it's important to remember that the amount of matter on Earth is conserved. So we remember from our previous modules that that energy is conserved in the first law of thermodynamics, and that therefore the number of carbon molecules that we have on Earth are the same number of carbon molecules that pretty much we've always had. So these elements are pretty much maintained in the quantity that we have on Earth. However, they can be moved from one location to another, right? So for example, if we have carbon in plants, we can move that carbon from plants and put it into the atmosphere in the form of CO2. So human beings are capable of affecting the flow of nutrients through these systems. And of course, these nutrients move around themselves too. So let's take a closer look at that. So I just mentioned the laws of thermodynamics. We remember there are the law of conservation of mass, which is related to these laws, that states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. And so like I mentioned, the amount of nitrogen on Earth is pretty much the amount of nitrogen that we've always been working with. It just moves from one form to another. So nitrogen can be in proteins, in amino acids that are in your body, or it can go into atmospheric nitrogen and become a gas. But it's the same molecule, right? Just connected to different elements. So chemical elements are continuously recycled within our ecosystem. For example, in a forest, nutrients are being taken up by the roots through the ground, and water carries a lot of nutrients around. Vegetation and trees are huge contributors to keeping nutrients in place in an ecosystem. So once you take away the vegetation in an area, that ecosystem tends to lose a lot of the nutrients as water just washes them away. And ecosystems are open systems, absorbing energy and mass and releasing heat and waste products. The name of this module is Nutrient Cycles, and we're going to talk a lot about how nutrients cycle through our ecosystem. We're going to specifically focus on carbon, but also oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen. We're going to talk about nitrogen as well, occur in the atmosphere and cycle globally, meaning that they move from one place to another as components of different kinds of molecules and organisms or material. Less mobile elements such as phosphorus or potassium will cycle on a more local level. So nitrogen really goes from being inside your body or inside any organism, and then it can be in the ground, it can be fixed by bacteria, and then it can be released back into the atmosphere. So nitrogen is very mobile. So all elements cycle between an organic and an inorganic reservoir, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And here's just a flowchart of how material can move throughout our ecosystems. Organic material available as nutrients, so living material, right, or decaying material, dead leaves, for example, can be fossilized, right, and turn into coal or oil. And when we burn them, those carbon molecules, for example, are going to go up into the atmosphere as CO2. Then these CO2 molecules can undergo respiration by other plants and become matter again. These elements can go into rocks, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is all of the opportunities that nutrients have to be part of organic and inorganic material on Earth. And when we talk about organic, in this case, we're talking about anything that had some form of life base, right? So plants, animals, even decaying matter, whereas inorganic material would be considered minerals, rocks, air, atmosphere, soil, water. Okay, so here's our trophic flow again, and on the previous slide we saw that carbon, for example, can go from being part of a living organism to being part of the atmosphere, or part of a fossil, or part of some other inorganic form. We talk a lot about carbon and nitrogen and these elements. Let's talk a little bit about why they're so important and why they are so critical for these trophic levels. When people say that we are a carbon-based life form, what does that mean? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some chemistry. It's not important for you to understand the chemistry. I just really want you to understand why we are focusing on these elements and on these molecules, and why when people talk about carbon and nitrogen, why these are so critical for us as living creatures. So here's a carbon molecule on the left. The red part is the actual carbon in the cartoon, and what they're showing you is that carbon can bind, it can connect to 4 other atoms, and that's really what makes carbon the basis of life on Earth. So the fact that carbon can bind to that many different molecules allows it to form these very complex forms. So you see on the right all the different kinds of forms carbon can take when it bonds to other elements or itself, right? So the ability to form 4 different connectors allows it to build very complex structures. And that's unique. It's not completely unique to carbon, but carbon is one element that can do that, a rare element that can do that. So that's why life evolved to be carbon-based, we think, because carbon has this very convenient chemical property. Let's take a look at some molecules that are carbon-based and nitrogen-based and see why these carbon and nitrogen and hydrogen atoms are so important for us as living creatures. Here I'm showing you a picture of fatty acids, and again, it's not really critical for you to understand the chemistry. I know that some of you probably have not taken chemistry yet, but if you look at the tail of the fatty acid here, so we see it has this long chain of C's, so that's each C is telling you that there's one carbon atom there, and we see that some of them are attached to H's as well. Those are hydrogen atoms, and these are hydrocarbon chains, what we call them. So we refer to hydrocarbons in other topics as well, such as oil, but in this case these are fatty acids, and we can see that carbons are attached to 4 different things, 4 different other atoms, and that gives them that nice complexity that gives us fats. And here's some more fats with some more hydrocarbon chains. Here's just a picture of a phospholipid, a fatty acid, 2 fatty acid tails, and a phosphate head. So that is what every cell in your body is coated in these phospholipids. Okay, what else are we made out of? So all of our fats are carbon and hydrogen based. These are amino acids, and we can see here that there's a lot of carbon in the amino acid chain. So these are individual amino acids. Here's C, C, N, C, C, N, C, C. So basically the backbone of proteins, right? So our cells are pretty much composed of fats and proteins and sugars and a lot of water and some salts and some other minerals and vitamins and things at smaller amounts. But we have a lot of protein in us. And we can see that proteins are made out of a lot of carbons and some nitrogens and a few hydrogens and oxygens as well. So nitrogen is critical for the proteins in our body to exist. Here's some more amino acids, just showing you again how the carbon is very prevalent there, and then we have a lot of nitrogen as well. So I hope you're getting the idea that why carbon is such an important element for us as living creatures, and nitrogen as well, right? So here's more just proteins. I'm just showing you more complex diagrams of what a protein looks like. Okay, what else are we made out of? We're made out of fats, proteins, water, salts, sugars, so carbohydrates, right? We need carbohydrates to live as well, and this is what carbohydrates look like. And they're not showing you in these stick figures here, but every point on these hectagons is a carbon molecule. So here's the molecule if you were to stretch it out straight, and you can see carbon, 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 carbon. So carbon is very important for sugars. Here's starch and cellulose. Those are two big sugar molecules that plants are made out of largely. Okay, so we've seen carbon is basically the backbone of every single molecule that so far we've looked at. That is integral to life. What other molecules can we think of? Here's nucleic acid, DNA. So DNA are the instructions that tell us how to make ourselves the way we are. So every cell in your body most of the cells in your body have DNA instructions to instruct your body how to build itself, what kind of proteins to make, and how to be a living creature. So we can see that the DNA bases are also carbon-based. If we look inside the rings, we see a lot of carbons there and a lot of nitrogens there as well. Additionally, we see phosphate groups coming out off of those nitrogenous bases, and the phosphate is also an element that cycles throughout our ecosystem and is important for life because every single DNA nucleotide has a phosphate on it. Here's DNA again, just showing you in a bigger form, just a picture of DNA. Okay, so let's talk about the cycling of some of these nutrients in our ecosystem. So now I've just given you hopefully an idea of why carbon is so important and the role that carbon has in the molecules in our body. And when we think about carbon cycling, we can think about those individual molecules that our proteins and our DNA and our fats are made out of, and think about where they came from. So probably from a lot of the food you ate, some of the carbon, what's the oldest carbon molecule, how long has the oldest carbon molecule been in your body, right? It's an interesting question. So have there been carbon molecules that have been part of your body since birth, right? Are those the same carbon molecules? And where did the carbon molecules come from that made you to begin with, right? So you got them from your mother when you were a fetus, and she probably gave them to you from the food she was eating. So she ate sources of carbon, and those got integrated into your body, and now you were made out of, initially at least, the food that your mother ate. And so that's basically when we talk about carbon cycling, we're just thinking about those molecules and how they're moving around. And when an individual passes away, or let's say an animal or a plant passes away, and let's say they die in the forest and they decompose, those carbon molecules are going to go back into the ecosystem in a different form. So same exact molecules, they'll be attached to different things, right? So if they're a fat molecule and they were attached to all of those hydrogens and as a hydrocarbon, they might lose those hydrocarbons and decay, and that carbon atom might just become something else. So they'll bond with different things and they'll become different types of material, but it's the same carbon atoms. Okay, so let's look at the carbon cycle a little bit. So carbon is essential to all organisms, like we've shown a lot of evidence for in the last few slides. Carbon reservoirs include fossil fuels, soils, sediments, solutes in ocean, plant, and animal biomass, and the atmosphere. So a lot of fossil fuels are organic material that fell onto the ground and was compressed over time and turned into fossil fuels. So when they talk about how oil is made out of the dinosaurs, that's what they mean. So fossil fuels are very carbon rich as well because they used to be largely organic material. So that's one source of carbon, and another big source of carbon on Earth is carbon dioxide, so CO2, which is in our atmosphere and in the air that we breathe, right? It's a big proportion of the air that we breathe. And plants take it up through photosynthesis. So we learned about photosynthesis and the fact that plants breathe it in, take it in, convert it to organic material, and breathe out oxygen in the process. And there's some other sources of CO2. So let's look at a map, a cartoon map of all of the CO2 in our biosphere and how it is cycling around. So a lot of carbon, not CO2. So a lot of carbon is present in organic material and living organisms, right? So plants take up CO2 through photosynthesis and convert it to matter. So that matter is the plants that they're actually made of. When we think back to the slide where I showed you carbohydrates and one of them was cellulose, a lot of cellulose is a huge fiber in the plant. It's made out of carbon, and so you could think about CO2 being converted to cellulose and making up trees. And then you have your primary consumers eating that, so the carbon is transferring from the plants to the primary consumer, and then when the higher level consumers eat the primary consumer, they are transferring that carbon to the higher level consumer. When any organism dies and it's allowed to decay, it will those carbon molecules are going to be decomposed and they will be converted back into a simpler form of carbon. There's a lot of carbon sources in the bottom of the ocean. So anytime even tiny organisms, even plankton and single cell organisms and tiny things are in the ocean and they die, they sink to the bottom. So the whole bottom of the ocean is actually covered in a huge kind of blanket of carbon sources of all of the living material that fell and decayed. And actually, people have ideas of how to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, get it to go into single cell organisms or small organisms in the ocean, and then when they die, they will fall to the bottom of the ocean, and that will sequester the carbon that's in the atmosphere. So that's one idea of that people have of how to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere. So how to move the CO2 from the atmosphere to just a carbon sink at the bottom of the ocean. When we burn fossil fuels, we're taking carbon from the earth that was that was decomposed or was converted to fossil fuels millions of years ago, and we're burning it, so that carbon becomes CO2 and goes into the atmosphere. So human beings are shifting the presence of carbon in a place from under the ground to our atmosphere. So we're moving all that carbon from some place that was relatively inaccessible previously, and we're moving it into our atmosphere where it is affecting other things. Okay, so that's our carbon cycle. And here's a picture of where carbon is generated on Earth. So they're showing you the primary production, right, of kilograms carbon per meter squared per year. So primary production is the amount of mass that's converted from CO2 to a mass form by plants, right? So when plants convert CO2 to actual biomass, where is that happening and how much is happening where? And we can see that a huge amount of primary production happens in the Amazon in Brazil. So that region in South America that's lighting up, that's all the primary production that we get from the rainforests in Brazil. And rainforests are there's so much primary production because of the temperature and the conditions that allow a lot of biomass to be generated. So they have nice temperature and nice humidity for a lot of different things to survive well.